Good morning to you all. In the interest of time, let us get started. Let me briefly introduce our speakers this morning and then get right down to the topic at hand. My name is Ariel Levite, and I am a non-resident senior fellow for the Carnegie Endowment. With me on the podium here, we have Jacques Bouchard, the chairman of Generation 4 Forum, and previously with a distinguished career at the French Atomic Energy Commission. And next to him is Ernie Moniz, Professor Ernie Moniz, who heads the MIT Energy Lab. He also had a distinguished career with the Department of Energy, in the last position being Undersecretary of Energy. And to my immediate left is Charles McCombie, who is both an independent consultant and also the executive director of an NGO called Arius, which deals with multinational solutions to the nuclear fuel cycle. What will set apart, I hope, this panel from the previous ones that have dealt with the prospects of the nuclear renaissance are two issues. One is we're trying to present a global perspective as distinguished from a US-oriented one. And the second thing is we're not trying to capture what is currently happening, but we are trying to figure out what needs to happen for nuclear energy to evolve in a successful, sustainable and a way, both from an economic, technical, and policy perspective. The order by which we'd go was Jacques Bouchard would go first and talk about technological and technical challenges that need to be met. Then Ernie Moniz would talk about political and policy challenges that lie in front of us. And then Charles McCombie will look at the things from an economic and industrial perspective and the kind of issues that need to be happening for nuclear energy to have a sustainable future. So without further ado, Jacques, please.
Thank you, Eli, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Eli said, I am there this morning to give the technical part of the show. So I will try to, in a few minutes, to summarize what are the challenges to succeed in the development of nuclear energy in the next decades, assuming, of course, that all the other problems, political and economical, are solved, but it's a matter for my colleagues. I would, we have limited time, so I would only touch upon three topics. The first one, safety, then sustainability, and adaptability. Why the choice of those three topics? Because I think that they are the most important one to succeed in the development of nuclear energy, whatever the choice which are made by various countries in the way they will develop their own system and the way they will use nuclear energy in the future. So let me start just by recalling that we have a need for developing energy. We have a need to develop, and it was stated in particular yesterday, that to succeed in satisfying, in fulfilling the needs, we will have to use nuclear energy, and we will have to use nuclear energy for many reasons, because there is no greenhouse gas emission, because there is a security of supply, because there are possibility of developing new systems, and also because it's already a competitive, safe, and reliable energy source. It has been demonstrated by the operation of the existing reactor during the last few decades. So what can be the future? If we want to discuss the challenges, of course, we have to place this discussion in some prospect on the future. My prospects are quite optimistic, and I would say voluntarily optimistic in such a way that we can really see where are the problems. So relying on a growing energy demand, the part of nuclear energy, we assume it will increase mainly after 2030, because it takes time to restart and to build all the new systems. But the part will increase, and light water reactors will remain dominant during these few decades, it's clear. And most of the new build will be in countries which have already large fleet. And this is a quite important problem. If we look to the prospect, let's say on this figure, on this slide, you see that we have made the assumption that there will be 1,400, why not? 1,400 gigawatts of nuclear energy by 2050. Most of it, once more, will be LWR, but most of it will be in countries which have already a large experience with nuclear energy, either developed countries, industrialized countries, or developing countries with large populations such as China or India. So in fact, more than 80% of the, more probably 90% of this capacity will be in such countries. Safety, first point, safety has been considerably improved during the decades, in the past decades, and in particular, a new move has been made with the development and with the design of Generation 3 systems. We have several Generation 3 systems on the market today. All of them are satisfying new criteria for safety, in particular not only a decrease, a reduction of the probability of severe accident, but in any case, a mitigation of the consequences. And this is clearly a new move, and we cannot and we will not go back. That means that any new nuclear system will have to satisfy the same criteria. And this is clearly a challenge. It's a challenge for the next generation, the challenge for the next development of systems, because it's not what we have considered in the past, and it's clearly a necessity today. So either by passive, active systems, whatever, we have no particular difficulty with that. There are a lot of possibilities to develop technically systems, but that means that in particular, if we develop new type of reactor, fast reactors, high temperature reactors, others, we will have to satisfy the same criteria as the Generation 3 light water reactors today. And this is the first point I would like to mention, because it's a clear objective today, and it's an objective which is not so easy to reach in any case. Now, what are the other issues for the future? Once more, the safety, we can consider that the level which is obtained with the Generation 3 systems is a reasonable one for the future. So this is clear. No major improvements on non-proliferations has been made during the last few days. The new developments of the system, let's say, during the last few decades were not considering new consideration for non-proliferation. And the need for sustainable development has also means the need to account for new criteria. And this has been at the origin of the development of the so-called Generation 4 systems. In fact, we have considered that if there was such a development of nuclear energy as the one mentioned, for instance, in the example I have given, we need to consider not only the economy and the safety as in the past, but we have also to consider more seriously the use of natural resources, the waste minimization, and the security problems. All these problems are quite important for the sustainability of the nuclear energy system. And those are technically very important problems. You know that it has been these considerations have been at the origin of the Generation 4 International Forum. Now we have 13 countries working together, at least 10 of them working efficiently in this cooperation for developing such system. And I think that you know that we have selected, let's say, a few basic concepts to help to make the good R&D in such a way that we can develop really new systems according to those criteria. So most of these basic concepts are fast reactor system, and it is clearly related to the fact that the uranium resource is not forever without any problem. In fact, when we look to the data which are published annually by both the IEA and the NEA, the OECD NEA, you know that we consider today that we have approximately 15 million tons of resources of uranium, and still yesterday we heard that with that we can feed the reactor for 200 years. 200 years there, if we keep the level of today. But if we increase the number of reactors by 4, by 3, or by 4, or by 5, by the middle of the century, it will no more be 200 years, it will be 50 years, 60 years, just the lifetime of the reactors, no more. So in fact, we are facing a real problem if there is an extension of the park of worldwide nuclear reactors, such as the one I have mentioned before. You see, for 1,400 gigawatts of nuclear energy by 2050, that means that we will have consumed or earmarked 16 million tons, more than the assumed resource today. Earmarked means that it will be consumed during the lifetime of the reactor. So there we have a real problem, and we know that we will have to move to fast reactors to solve this question, because even if we consider the possibility of using the uranium in the phosphate, which is approximately 20 million tons, even if we look to other sources of more expensive uranium, it will be anyway limited to a few decades more maybe, but it's not the solution for long term. So for long term, we have to move to fast reactors in such a way that we can breed. It's not new, but it's clear that if there is a development of nuclear energy, such a one we are considering today, this move to fast reactor will have to be done during this century, not after. And this is clearly an option which is on the table today. The other problem is the accumulation of spent fuel and the content of this spent fuel. Always still with the same scenario, that means with 1,400 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2050, we will have in store approximately 1 million tons of spent fuel around the world. 1 million tons in store, if we do nothing before. And those 1 million tons of spent fuel will include 88,500 tons of plutonium. So there will be, everywhere around the world, 8,500 tons of plutonium available for any good use or any wrong use, depending on who is in charge of keeping them. So, I mean, this is the other real issue. And for that, we said, okay, we cannot consider that anyway, if we need to use fast reactor and to breed, we will have to recycle. And if we recycle, we should solve this problem of risk of increasing the proliferation risk because of the recycling. And this is the reason why in the Gen 4 systems, we are working on full actinide recycling. That means they are working no more on reprocessing with separate elements at the output of the process, but looking only on reprocessing, giving all the actinide together in such a way that in the waste we have only the fission products, but the actinides remains together in all the process, which means that the materials which is used in the reprocessing plant, in fact, is always a very active one. There is no risk of diversion, easy diversion of materials, such as the scenario which are often used in proliferation studies related to this part of the fuel cycle. By the way, at the same time, we solve also, or at least we help to solve the problem of waste management, because in fact, burning all the actinides made the decrease of the radioactivity of the waste with the time much more efficient, in such a way that we reach level comparable to the uranium after only a few hundred years, which is, of course, a good major improvement for waste management if we can say, okay, we have to keep the waste, including the high-level waste, but only for some few hundred, even few thousand years. There is no more problem of 1 million years, as we heard yesterday. There is no more problem of making demonstration that we can overcome the 10,000 years with any kind of storage. I mean, we can easily solve the problem in such a way. So, for that, we have to develop fast reactors. As I said, there are new requirements. The economy, of course, the safety, the notion 3, the full recycling of the minor actinide, some new solution for the breeding to avoid proliferation risk. I mean, this is clearly on the table, and we are working on it in Generation 4 International Forum, and I think we will succeed in developing such system. Now, there are other challenges. I have no time to develop them. I would just mention the fact that we are working on high temperature for other use of nuclear energy, it's clear. But I will just make a mention on the adaptation for countries. You heard about this grid-appropriate type of reactors, which is more or less in discussion around the world. In fact, today we consider the problem of countries which start in the nuclear business, the main problem for them in infrastructure. And the IAEA has made a lot of development on what they have to do and so on. Small or medium-sized reactors is certainly not the solution in the short term. Why that? For two reasons. The first one, because the country which starts now want to have a proven system, and no one around the world is operating small or medium-sized reactor today. And the second reason, because we need, as I said before, to have the level of safety of Generation 3. And there is not yet any small or medium-sized reactor developed with this level of safety. So I think that the main issue on the technical side for those countries is not so much the size of the reactor. We can find a way to accommodate the grid, to have agreement with other countries and so on. The real problem is robustness. Robustness because new countries working in the field mean new people without experience. And even if they are helped by countries or by organizations which have a lot of experience, it's better to start with robust and more robust systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ernie, please enlighten us on policy and political issues.
Perhaps. Well, thank you, Ellie.
You're allowed to disagree with Jacques wherever I noticed that there are a couple of areas.
It's always good to follow my friend Jacques.
They're always playing this odd couple dynamics.
Okay, I'll just make a few remarks, largely around a framework really discussed over the last 5 years with colleagues at MIT and with the Scowcroft group. Clearly, this discussion is a focus on nuclear fuel cycle issues and proliferation and threshold state issues. So from this point of view, I want to just distinguish that, for example, Iran would be more relevant than, say, North Korea to the kinds of discussion at least I intend to have. And obviously, it's all about weapons usable material, HEU and plutonium, and so, of course, enrichment and recycling are the two questions of issue. The framework in which we always try to talk about a framework that does not involve things like reopening the fundamentals of the NPT, but rather focus on a balance of economic choices, believable security of fuel supply guarantees, like the fuel bank that President Obama just mentioned, for example, and resolution of internal, let's call them political challenges in individual countries, such as is often the case with the nuclear waste back end that, in fact, Jacques just made some comments on. A third framing point, I would say, is that clearly, at least I certainly believe that climate change risk mitigation will remain a major concern and indeed will increase in prominence. Again, recent news, the Arctic ice sheet disappearance acceleration, for example, and combined with energy supply and security concerns, and I think also importantly, and not often enough emphasized, uncertainties in fossil fuel price volatility, I think will all be strong forces for driving expansion of nuclear power worldwide. There are countervailing issues, of course, around the large capital expenditures, for example, for certainly today's plants and financing structures. There are issues of waste management, proliferation, and the need for, in some sense, a dependence on safe operation everywhere are factors which come in with different weightings in different countries. And finally, in sense of kind of framing remarks, I'll just note that in 2002, as part of an MIT nuclear power report, we did a scenario for global deployment of a 1 to 1.5 terawatt nuclear power future in 2050. Again, certainly consistent with the kinds of numbers that Jacques was using. I want to make clear, it was not a prediction or a wish necessarily. It was a scenario of what would a distribution of a terawatt or a terawatt plus most likely look like if it were achieved. And the terawatt, the reason for the terawatt is that is kind of the material unit for contributing to serious climate risk mitigation. So it was really a question of, if nuclear power is to be a material contributor to climate risk mitigation, what would it look like? Now, one can argue with it, but what we did is go through kind of a country-by-country scenario in terms of what looked likely. And the relevant points are two, at least as we saw it. Number one is when you include the nuclear weapon states, and I'm including in there not only the P5 but also India and Pakistan. And you look at the scenario. Number one, it's very hard to see, in our view, how the world reaches 1.5 terawatts unless the United States is a major player. So in some sense, the U.S. role is critical, 300, maybe even 400 gigawatts. Secondly, those nuclear weapons states, as I've defined it, in total, would account for over 60% of that deployed 1 to 1.5 terawatt. By my definition, I am not considering those to be fuel cycle deployment risks. They have dedicated programs. I'm not saying one shouldn't worry about the nuclear weapons issue. I'm just saying that the nuclear fuel cycle is not the primary concern. Others, Indonesia, Brazil, Iran, for example, just those three countries would be, say, 50 gigawatts in this scenario. The important issue is, in our scenario, is that if you look at the expansion of nuclear power in the terawatt plus scenario into countries that you would consider to be part of this proliferation discussion, some of direct concern with regard to nuclear weapons development and or threshold state status, others not really of concern in that sense, at least with our current politics, but nevertheless ones that we should include in this bucket. We could not see how that group of states would account for more than about 20% of that terawatt scenario. And today it's about 15%. This is relevant in the sense of the degrees of freedom that I think it permits one in talking about institutional arrangements for the growth of nuclear power. And I'll come back to that. I mean, the basic argument is very simple. Our view was that a key issue is, what is one going to do with the spent nuclear fuel? We would view it as a considerable incentive in a fuel leasing arrangement to take back the spent nuclear fuel, and not with the idea of just processing it, as is the current practice, and then in principle returning the high-level waste to the country, but actually returning the fuel and disposing of it according to one's national program. Then I think it's a very important issue to realize that the increment from, let's call it, countries of concern would be a relatively small one on top of the challenge for waste management in the United States, Europe, Japan, no matter what you think of how difficult or how easy that challenge is, it's a relatively small increment. So as I've already said, all of this leads to our view remains that some sort of fuel leasing arrangement with incentives in which there is secure supply of fresh fuel and then a return of spent fuel remains at the key. This is not inconsistent with international fuel cycle centers as well, although we'll come back to that point briefly. So basically, again, at least our view is that some form of this fuel leasing would be an ideal approach. We would supplement that by adding in relatively strong incentives along the lines I said earlier, economic, political, etc. For example, fresh fuel could be subsidized in a way which has an international condominium, not necessarily by direct payments, but, for example, at least in the current world in which nuclear power generally is not considered admissible for things like international carbon credits and trading, one could imagine a system in which the relatively small number of countries who opt into this are given carbon credits. That may be just one simple example of how one might incentivize it. But just to note that the kinds of carbon pricing discussed in any international carbon trading system would translate for a subsidy of nuclear fuel into something that would essentially cover the entire cost of fuel and some operations of the reactor. Taking back spent fuel, as I mentioned earlier, globally it's a less than 20% issue, at least for this half century, and here I must say that obviously from the United States perspective, one would say, well, given our situation and the shall we say, the considerable uncertainty surrounding Yucca Mountain. The administration has said Yucca Mountain is not an issue. One might find this to be kind of deadly for the kind of thing I'm talking about. I would argue not. Indeed, frankly, I think that taking a relook at the waste management situation may turn out to be a very good thing. We do not have a technical rush, and we, at least I personally, have always felt that long-term managed storage, in fact, makes good sense. And third, we would argue that there is no need. This goes back now to the issue of the NPT. There is no need to advocate such a system to be forever. There's nothing wrong with taking it, say, in 10-year increments, where there are commitments. One sees how the international nuclear fuel cycle evolves, and countries can make, say, let's say 10 years or 15-year commitments in terms of the fuel leasing arrangement, gain the benefits in that time period, and then return to it later on. There are other issues, of course, like adherence to additional protocols. I won't go into those. Now, there are several issues raised with any of these schemes. Security of supply, we've already discussed the fuel bank idea. In our view, the fuel bank should be only one part of a hierarchy of security of supply arrangements that start with commercial contracts and rely upon them to the extent possible, but then eventually go up to a fuel bank with Security Council guarantees. There's the issue of technological leadership. Would countries feel that they were falling behind? Well, we would advocate that we have, with all due respect, not a Gen 4 forum, but a real R&D program with collaboration on reactors, although not on all fuel cycle technologies, so countries opting in would not somehow, quotes, be left behind in terms of a possible future advanced reactor program. Then there's the issues of asymmetry and incentives, but we would argue again that with the economic and political benefits, this could be framed, frankly, as a victory. In concluding, I'll just point to a few other issues that I think are needed in this framework to have anything like this kind of a framework going forward. One is that we certainly need to reestablish our nuclear cooperative relationships with Russia. It's hard to see how things go forward otherwise. I will note that in 2000, we were very, very close, frankly. Close is not good enough, to a significant agreement with Russia that would have advanced these kinds of issues. I believe we have a good chance to return to that in the context of a 1-2-3 agreement. Another kind of issue is let's say the UAE and Abu Dhabi. Again, another 1-2-3 issue in front of us. There are clearly questions in terms of some history of transshipment, et cetera. But I believe if we're serious on the non-proliferation side, we simply have to make that work and work with them as an excellent model. On uranium, I have to say that, well, okay, so, and finally, my last comment will be on kind of fuel cycles, et cetera, just to excite some discussion with Jacques. First of all, there is no pressure, in our view, whatsoever from the uranium side to move towards reprocessing. And I think Jacques' own numbers would suggest that there is plenty of time, particularly in light of the history about resources. I'm sorry, just 1 minute as an aside, I think it's worth. Let's talk about natural gas, something that's quite present. We're running out of natural gas. We've had fuel acts to control its use, all kinds of issues. Now we have so-called unconventional natural gas. 9% increase in domestic production last year. But an interesting point is this issue of finding new resources, especially, quotes, unconventional ones, the implication that these have enormous costs just is not in accord with our history with natural resources. Indeed, in the current economic downturn, the number of gas drilling rigs has fallen by about a factor of half. The first ones to go were the so-called conventional drilling rigs, because a lot of the unconventional supply is now, at the margin, economically more attractive. It's just very hard to believe that we don't have uranium coming out of our ears for a long, long time. It will take other issues to drive us towards different fuel cycles. And on that, I strongly believe that we must continue to very strongly oppose a spread of the Purex MOX fuel cycle, which, in my view, has essentially no redeeming positive features. We'll have an argument with Jacques in terms of economics or waste management, while we do support the issue of looking at more advanced fuel cycles that could in the long term have some benefits, some serious benefits for waste management. So I think those are all very important framing issues for the bigger thing around fuel leasing, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernie. Charles, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to address the economic and the industrial challenges that we're facing if nuclear is going to expand the way some people think it will. The issues I've picked out are listed here. This cost-effective generation, of course, the issue of availability of large components, training, education, providing in the operation of the facilities the safety and security that we want, and lastly, and with most weight, I hope, the provision of disposal solutions for all the countries that are going to use nuclear power. So these are the issues I'm going to talk to. I'm going to move through them because of the time fairly quickly, and also because there are experts who know more about some of these issues than I do. But I'll address them one at a time and try to give you a simple finish message for each. On the cost-effective side, of course, we know that the licensing and construction times are not good and they need to be improved, and some of the latest results are not very encouraging. The capital costs could be coming down. The financial crisis is affecting things already. South Africa has backed off from its over-ambitious plans already. The generation cost, this is the good news. The life cycle costs are low, and I'll come to that in a minute. And the back-end costs, they are still high, and they tend to be ignored. You know, a deep geological repository for the back end of the back end costs the same order of magnitude of buying your first reactor, and people should remember that. If you look at the costs, because we're international, I'll use one from my own second home country, from Switzerland. You don't have to read all of this slide. The important point is that right down in the corner here, there's nuclear. The two bars for each technology are for 2000, 2030. So in this Swiss situation, this is a government study, then nuclear life cycle costs are the cheapest, and they're going to stay the cheapest for a long time. Now, I get confused as well, because if you look around in the States, of course, the message you get here is very different very often, including in Ernie's MIT study, for example. The difference is largely to do with the financing mechanisms that are around there. Even Greenpeace has latched on to this. The Nuclear Energy Forum of the European Union has just produced a study on the competitiveness of nuclear power, which ends with a quote, "In all cases, financing can be assured without nuclear subsidies." And they look at all the risks. And that doesn't sync with what happens here. And I think, as I say, it's partly to do with how the financing's done and so on. Life cycle costs over the long time have been criticised as not being the most relevant thing. I think maybe we should be looking more at life cycle costs. Maybe we need to think long term. Maybe we should have Warren Buffett and not Bernie Madoff as an example of how we should be doing our finances into the future. So it's the costing issue. The second issue was the components. The availability of components has been discussed quite a lot in the industry. The biggest problem is the large forgings. Currently only in the Western world, Japan Steelworks makes these and nobody else does. But without going into details, this is the kind of challenge which the industry in general is geared up to try to match. And you can see on this overhead some of the efforts that are now being put in place to start that. So to make it very clear, I think this is the kind of technological challenge that the industry can manage. So this is one, in some ways, of the easier challenges. The next one was the availability of trained staff. This is not a new problem, as it says there. Already there was a big NEA study and report chaired by Tom Isaacs at the back of the room there. In 2000, this was when we were worried about having enough people for the death of the nuclear industry, for it dropping out. And now it's going the other way, so the needs are even higher. Luckily, as you see at the bottom, people are taking this much more seriously now. It was neglected for far too long, but the efforts have been increased hugely, but it has to be sustained. And we need action, not words, not talking about education, but doing education, doing training. I work in some training things, and when we put out appeals to send your people to be trained, there are still some bosses there who come out and they say, I can't afford to lose them for the 2 weeks, 6 weeks, or whatever is necessary. So that doesn't work. You have to have action to back up the lip service being paid many places to the training and education part. Safety, security, non-proliferation. I don't have to say much at a conference like this. There are many, many more experts out there, but reactor accident anywhere is everywhere. We know that. In the reactor operational side, there's been large efforts made, and they've been very successful. Nuclear security has been improved. The new World Institute of Nuclear Security just recently started up, will help there. We need to strengthen up the methods that we use. We need to attack also the latent proliferation and how we do it, and maybe it will be done more rationally in the new administration than it was done in the previous administration. And we have to have a fissile control of fissile materials, and we've heard very recently that these things are moving ahead. So this is good. These are national and global issues. Technological approaches are necessary. They have to be further developed, but they're not enough. We have to have improved governance at a national scale and at an international scale. Lastly, this disposal issue, which is close to my heart. Disposal, as we heard in the first part of this panel yesterday, is not done geological disposal anywhere in the world. There are some programs which are well along the way. You see them mentioned here, Finland, France, Sweden. Some, many, don't have any program at all. The point is that even if they all try to have programs, we have to have a multinational approach. And we need this because the small nations, as I said, can't afford it. We had plans for take-back. I made in the previous, this morning already, a comment about that. The take-back plans that were built into GNEP disappeared even before GNEP started to disappear. The Russians had the global nuclear power infrastructure by Putin, had hit the same kind of problems. So the other option to take back is partnering, and I'm very closely involved with partnering concepts, and I thought I would illustrate that with an overhead which some of you may have seen, but it's well worth re-showing. This is the USA with very generously marked 2 geological repository projects. I think one of them should be in a dotted signature, perhaps. But if I put on the same scale, I put Europe, and it fits pretty well, as you see. And in Europe, there are different. Some countries have a national program, some don't know yet, and some are willing to look at sharing, and some do not have nuclear power yet, but even if they don't, they need deep geological repositories. And this is the point. If we do not have any partnering, if we do not have any sharing, if everybody has to build their own deep geological repository, which will cost several $1 billion, then that's the number that we need in Europe. And this is just a role model. This applies other places in the world. It applies in the Southeast Asia, applies in Central and South America, applies in the Arab countries. We have to do it. There's no way we can have everybody with its own deep geological repository. So that was the international part. I'll finish off with an outsider's view, if I may, of some of the US back-end program points. Firstly, that the US lost its leadership role in the fuel cycle way back in the 70s. It chose to lose it, if you like. It's now rediscovering recycling, but some of the issues in the GNEP, which built this in, were pretty flawed. Importing French technology and copying a French plant does not seem to be the way forward. The National Academy has taken a position on that, which I very much agree with. We want to be looking at advanced ways to do this. There's no hurry. I agree with Arnie Moniz to do reprocessing. So the US also lost its lead in repository development to some extent because of all of the problems that were had with Yucca Mountain. The price tag rose and rose and rose, and it became $1, $2, $3, $4, $9 billion. It strikes terror into the hearts of people in other countries of the world. And the fact of the prospect of having to pay $9 billion without having built anything. And it's also too top-down. It's an old-fashioned, now that because of when it was done, kind of development program, so that these things were lost. But the USA is, by nature, got to be a leader. It's got to get back to being a leader in the nuclear community. So what should it do? Well, the first thing it might do is let the US NRC decide on Yucca Mountain. The Obama administration made a strong point of using sound science in its policy, but it seemed to have left this little corner of policy out there. The NRC should be trusted to be able to judge whether Yucca Mountain is sound science or not. So let it go. However, if it is sound science, it doesn't solve the problem. Sound science today is not enough to cite a geological repository. It's got to be complemented by some kind of societal acceptance. Enough. Not the whole of society, but enough. So that even if the sound science is there, it's not enough, and that's been recognized in many places. The other thing one could do while waiting on the US NRC and on this commission that should be formed is revive the second repository program with consensual citing as its target there. People do not know. I get kind of from outside, because I was involved with this for a long time, I get slightly irritated when I see the 70,000 tons in Yucca Mountain being described all the time as a statutory limit. It's not a statutory limit. It's a number that was chosen for ethical reasons. The latest US DOE report on the necessity for a second repository ends with big, bold conclusion: unless we increase the capacity of Yucca Mountain beyond 70,000, we will need a second repository. That's why the 70,000 was there, to make sure that you did need a second repository. For ethical reasons, it was decided way back then that the US should have more than one repository. So this circular conclusion was really kind of a waste of paper writing the whole of the report there. So you could revise the second repository program, and who knows what then happens to Yucca Mountain. So that's in principle how I would do it for there. So a credible US national program should be first there. If the US is going to lead again, it needs a long-term storage solution that's good. It needs advanced recycling and research. It needs to look at other siting options, and it has to work on an adaptive or a staged siting process that goes beyond science and technology and into societal issues. And then lastly, and not least in my agenda certainly, the US could help a lot by supporting multinational initiatives with fuel take-back, with third-party, third-country hosting, or with partnering in the ways that I said. Thank you.
Charles, when I look at the kind of challenges you put forward, I don't think there's going to be a nuclear renaissance in the United States anytime soon. All right. You know the deal, the drill. Let's go for questions. Make sure it's a question. Keep it brief. Go ahead. Please identify yourselves.
Thank you. Stephen Dawley with Platts. I think this debate is already well underway, but I just wanted to throw it back to the panel for a little more elaboration because it's not just hypothetical or PowerPoints. An AREVA official said last week that AREVA has been talking to a number of U.S. utilities about possibly building a privately financed, not conventional Purex, but not advanced type reprocessing plant in the United States with thermal MOX recycling as the option. So what I'm interested in perspective from the panel is, and there have been some incident already, obviously, will this help the nuclear renaissance, hurt the nuclear renaissance, help or hurt the development of the advanced fuel cycles down the line, or will it just sort of be a sidetrack on the interim?
Shall I go first this time so you can respond?
No, you can start if you want.
You start? Okay.
You're going to get disagreement in the panel.
Oh,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
no, sure.
No, we are not. No, we are not in disagreement. No, I will not comment on the announcement. I would just comment on the situation once more of the spent fuel accumulation and necessity to by some way to start recycling not too late. I heard my friend Ernie saying that we have time, so we can take time to develop new system, and we will see, and so on. I agree that we have to develop new system. It's my job. I'm chairing this forum, and we try to gather all the knowledge around the Earth to work the best way to prepare new system. But at the same time, I think that we should move. We cannot wait forever. We cannot wait to start to clean by some way. And I can say that the experience we have in France is mostly interesting in this way. It's interesting because we have cleaned 90% of the past fuel, spent fuel. We have separated the uranium, plutonium, and from the rest, and the rest is already vitrified. So even if we take 10 years more to open the disposal, and we will open the disposal repository by 2025, even if it takes some years more, it's not a problem because everything is vitrified, everything is installed, no problem, no more to process anything on it. So I mean, once more, I would like to avoid to oppose development, future system, more efficient, more perfect, and so on, to the fact that we have also to move. We cannot wait forever. We accumulate, and I would not like to be in the situation of having the responsibility to have accumulated so much fuel somewhere, and the next generation, my son or my grandson, will say, okay, what have they done in the time? They have let us all this matter to clean now, and I mean, it's a real problem. It's not only a technical problem.
Well, go quickly. There are other, which I consider to be more pressing intergenerational issues, for example, proliferation. I would argue we are less prepared to handle some of that than we are this spent fuel issue. Let me say, by the way, first of all, I mean, as far as France goes, I mean, France in the 1970s, it was a different time, and France, obviously, the country, or Japan, for that matter, with far different natural resource, energy resource situation. And so a choice was made. What I'm talking about is the issue of the spread of the specific, particularly the Purex MOX fuel cycle, to other countries, because again we are in fact at a different time. The issue of the accumulation of the spent fuel, talking about 1 million tons or whatever, just does not particularly move me. And indeed, going back to the question as it was framed, My personal view is that in the United States, putting everything else aside, my view is that if there were a strong move right now to go to essentially conventional reprocessing, I do believe it would be a complication for what I consider to be a more important issue right now, which is moving forward on first mover nuclear plant construction so we can understand in the United States what a new generation of nuclear power plants would actually cost to build and operate, to go through the new licensing procedures, and to see if nuclear power is or is not going to be a material contributor to climate risk mitigation. I think that is the open question. To me, it's the most important question, and we are just getting into sideshows with these other discussions.
Thank you. Please.
Miles Popper from the Center for Nonproliferation Studies. Two questions. One, you mentioned, several of the panelists mentioned GNEP. I was wondering both your thoughts on whether it will continue in some form or another in the Obama administration and whether it should. And the second question is for Monsieur Bouchard on the United States has concluded a 1-2-3 agreement with the UAE, as Dr. Moniz said, which calls for take-back of our technology if the UAE engages in enrichment and reprocessing. I was wondering if France would be willing to conclude similar agreements.
Well, it's difficult, I think, for anybody, even inside the States, to decide whether GNEP will continue. I think it would be good if it did continue, in particular with its international component. It's been a good forum getting people together. The GNEP people are very keen on showing a long list of countries that are in there. That actually is interesting to make a list of countries that are not in there and do a comparison, which actually shows some of the aspects of GNEP which caused some disquiet. For some countries, they thought, understandably, in my opinion, that GNEP was threatening to take more from them than it was offering to give them. But if you work on these things, and as I say, the international part certainly seems to have given a good forum for collaboration, which is always good.
Jacques, you want to respond on France, the question with respect to France?
What
and
agreement
the UAE?
What agreement was?
Abu Dhabi.
Abu Dhabi, okay. Yeah. Okay, let's say two things. First, I will just add a comment on GNEP. Of course, the US will manage the program as they intend to do, but I think that there have been a clear wish for many countries participating in this discussion to continue to have this kind of forum for political discussions. It's clearly political discussions about the way we can progress in the future for the fuel cycle around the world. So I think that whatever the program itself, it's important to keep such a possibility of discussion. And it's, of course, it's in parallel with the IAEA, and you can say why not to have this discussion within the IAEA. In fact, it's, I think that the advantage of the forum offered by GNEP is to be limited to the countries which are interested. That means there are 20, 30 countries discussing together. All of them are really interested by the topic, and all of them are willing to progress. Concerning the agreement with new countries such as the Emirates, it's clear that if there are all the agreements France will sign, will always be including the IAEA, including all the rules. We are discussing together, and we are supporting completely within the IAEA.
I'm asking the question about if there's a condition on renouncing enrichment and reprocessing, and if there's going to be equipment take-back, as the US-UAE agreement calls for.
No, I think that it's clear that if we are supporting a program, for instance, in the Emirates, it will be a program of reactors and with a fuel supply, complete fuel supply, but certainly not with fuel cycle facilities.
Yeah, they probably were going to take it, reprocess it, then send back the vitrified waste. And so they can't do legally more than interim storage.
No, but no fuel, no facilities.
Please.
Yeah. Paul Gunter with Beyond Nuclear. I would like the panelists to comment on Given the fact that governments are now going to be both the financer and the builder of this next generation, could you comment on the challenges and conflicts of being both the promoter and the regulator?
Do you want to say something about that?
Well, for the United States, I mean, it's by no means clear. I think the statement that the United States would be both financier and regulator. First of all, I do want to reinforce what Charles said, that the financing arrangements are absolutely critical to the economics of high capital cost projects, be they nuclear or renewables. Just that the chunks are a lot different in renewables than they are in nuclear. So the financing is critical. Within the United States, you have very, very different arrangements according to different regulatory structures, different parts of the country. But I think in terms of the United States, at least our position is that we did support the idea of public subsidies for a few first mover plants, given the fact that the marketplace is not conditioned, carbon prices, regulatory structures. But we are equally opposed to having any continuing subsidy for any technology, specifically including nuclear. So my assumption is that it will go, maybe there'll be some gigawatts of support, and then the whole system, hopefully, well, in my view, hopefully with the carbon pricing coming into place, it'll be a market decision, recognizing the markets are conditioned differently in different countries and even in different parts of the United States.
I would just add that, again, emphasising it's different outside the United States. In my home country, Switzerland, we have 3 general permit applications in for new reactors. None of them are financed by the government in any way. And in other countries, the Finnish reactors are also not directly financed by the government. Yeah? So that there is not this conflict that you mentioned there. And even if there were, in some countries, there's always been that, even before, where the government regulates, and all it can do is separate the powers as high in the system as it possibly can, as has happened in the States.
Mr. Garwin.
I'm Dick Garwin, IBM Fellow Emeritus. On Generation 4, I would have liked to have heard of substantive progress in some of these plants. And I have a question, though. Yesterday, Bob Rosner said the only way to make progress really is through a science-based simulation approach. And that would mean having a laboratory in which one perfected the tools of simulation at all scales and could design a reactor as we designed the 777 Boeing aircraft without having a prototype. So eventually one would have a prototype. And I just wondered whether we are making progress sufficiently rapidly in the old-fashioned Generation 4 forum rather than in this simulation science-based approach.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think it's quite important to point to 2 things. The first one, Bob yesterday was speaking mainly of the tool used by the nuclear industry, and I can say that most of the laboratories around the world, including the US laboratories, of course, but also the French one, the Japanese one, and so on, are using more advanced tools for looking to the future. The major reason for that is well known by most of you. It's due to the fact that it's very difficult to have agreement for new tools from the safety authorities. It takes time, and so the industry takes new tools only when it's really completely needed, and after a lot of procedure to have them accepted, let's say, by the safety authority. So it means that in practical, we have development programs which are by some way science-based with new tools, and I can say, for instance, in the field of thermohydraulics, the work which is done both for supercritical water system or even for liquid metal cooling, they are made with very, very advanced tools and with the best. And we have also development for the fuels in particular, with ab initio tools, with completely new developments. So we are developing with the most advanced. Of course, we can do better. We can do always make progress, but I mean, we have a very advanced tool for the development. And on the other hand, let's say the business as usual work of the industry is done with tools which have the advantage of being well known by everybody, including the safety authority.
I would just add to Dick's comment. I must say I share the idea that when all is said and done, progress is really painfully slow and possibly absent.
Sharon Squastone, the Carnegie Endowment. Thanks for a very interesting panel, a nice compliment to the one we did yesterday. I had a question for Jacques and one for Charles. Jacques, you said that small to medium reactors were not a long-term solution, and I'm assuming you're talking about the new nuclear states, that nobody's operating smaller reactors. It may be that the big vendors are not prepared to sell. For example, Westinghouse has a 600 megawatt reactor licensed, but it's not marketing it. What about other countries like India, which does operate 200 to 300 megawatt reactors? They're CANDU based. What kind of risks might that pose? And then my question for Charles was on cost. I noticed that, and maybe I couldn't quite see, it looked like the cost figures you had for Swiss reactors were Gen 2 and Gen 3, which leads me to believe that those are existing reactors. I think nobody nobody would dispute the fact that existing reactors, the life cycle costs are quite low. It's true in the U.S., somewhere between 3 and 8 cents per kilowatt hour. However, the new reactors estimates, and nobody knows for sure, but they're much higher in the U.S., 11 to 14 cents per kilowatt hour, which really calls into question their cost effectiveness. Overall, when you look across the world, I know the U.S. has certain characteristics like deregulated electricity markets and other things, weak dollar, et cetera, but can you make some kind of judgment across other countries that will they be experiencing smaller costs for new reactors? Thanks.
I start? Thank you, Sharon, for the question. I think that this matter of small and medium-sized reactor is not an easy one. You mentioned, you were right, that the makers today are not selling such reactors. I think they are not selling because there are no market. In fact, when they have made it's clear that when Westinghouse or GinaR Electric have made the economic calculation for their model of 600 megawatt, they have decided to move to 1,000 and to even more because it was not marketable due to the cost. So it's one of the reasons why it's difficult to imagine today that we will develop small reactors, such small or medium-sized reactor for new countries. They will have the same economical problem. But the second reason, once more, is that we need to have proven system for those countries. And as long, the only chance will be if for any reason there was a kind of niche which appears in developed countries and which need to use small reactors to satisfy the needs. I heard, for instance, sometimes it was a question of developing new system like Jack for Alaska or for other countries. Okay, if some part of the country needs to have small reactors like that, you can develop the small reactors. Okay, there will be experience by countries with all the experience on the systems, and after that means 10 years after, it will be marketable in other countries, if economically speaking it's acceptable. So today, I am not completely pessimistic on the long term, and in fact we are working on small reactors in the long term, in particular with high temperature reactors or fast reactors. But I think that the prospect of developing small light water reactors for new countries today, in my view, is completely dead.
Jacques, the one comment, the one question, part of the question you didn't answer was she was implying that ACL was out there pushing India. Type of CANDUs.
I have not answered on India. And there my answer is clear. We are not, today we consider that we should not develop more heavy water reactors for new countries. It's not reasonable from the proliferation point of view.
Charles, you want to come in on the second question very quickly because we have a long list of people.
Very, very quickly, of course. There's also the PBMR. The South Africans were looking at 165 megawatt reactors for distributed use in other kind of countries. On the cost issue, I hardly dare to, Sharon knows much more about it than I do, but this is for future. It was not for the existing reactors, it was for future build. It was done, a study by Stefan Hirschberg for the government, and they were looking, in fact, at the Generation 3 reactors when they did it. I can give you the full study so you can look at all the numbers afterwards.
Could I just note, Ellie, on that one point, that you may know in our MIT study in 2003, well, 2002 really, the work was done, we had a careful look at the economics based upon data. At that point, we talked about overnight costs, not owner's costs, but overnight costs of $2,000 a kilowatt. That was roundly criticized by various vendors. It proved to be low. I would just note that we have a new study. It should be posted on the website very, very soon. The lead author is John Parsons, and it will talk about an update based upon recent experience of the data on power plants, and transparent again, and you can put in whatever financing costs you want to get the levelized costs.
Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name is Jill Perillo from Physicians for Social Responsibility. Monsieur Bouchard, we're making you work really hard today, but I have one final question for you. I was wondering if you could outline for us France's plans with COEX and GANEX, and how France thinks this will enhance non-proliferation policy, and in particular a timeline when you foresee using these technologies in the future. Thank you.
What is it? COEX. A few plans for COEX.
Yeah. Once more, as I said, thank you for the question. As I said before, I think that we cannot solve everything in the following day or in the following months. We should proceed by step by step. Today we have existing reprocessing plants which are based on the Purex system, and we know that, of course, they cannot be applied everywhere. We can certainly not recommend to build such new plants in other countries, except in countries which offers all the guarantees. And in particular, I don't think the problem is really in the US. But anyway, we have to progress. And today we are able to build new plants. If we were deciding to build a new plant tomorrow, we will use the so-called COEX process, which is a way to limit the separation and to extract both plutonium and uranium together in order to, let's say, make more difficult, even if not impossible, more difficult the separation for long use of the plutonium. So this is a step. It's clearly not an objective for the long term. It's a step if we once more, if we need to, and in our view, it's necessary to develop recycling. If we need to build new plants now, we have this process. In 10 years from now, probably we will have another process. And then we will see after that what is the best one. But once more, it's still an intermediate step. And because it's an intermediate step, and because there are still some inconvenience, some drawbacks from the proliferation point of view in particular, we are still thinking that it should be limited to a few countries. But okay, it's a step in the development.
Thank you. Please.
Joseph D. Thomas from Civilian Research and Development Foundation. In the last presentation, there was a discussion about the need for human capacity building, which I took to be largely focused at the existing nuclear industry. If you look at this from the point of view of new entrants, the problem might even be more daunting. So when you say action, not words, thinking about how to fill the capacity needs of new entrants, what would an action plan be, in your view?
Let me try and pick up that question and just say the following. I mean, a lot of it depends on whether the new entrants would rely on operators who are transnational in nature, who would be going and operating the reactors for them. And I think for some of the new entrants, this is what they are looking for, which would still require development of skills for an independent regulatory authority and things of that nature, but would lower the initial sort of demands in terms of human resources. If they actually want to do the whole thing, I think we're talking about a complete shortage of skills available. in terms of both, even in terms of enough trainers to get them to do it. But more importantly, this is not just an issue of training, this is an issue of development of security culture, and a safety culture, and a nuclear culture, if you wish. That's a 20-year prospect. So I think it's going to be daunting, and wherever you're going to see rapid progress is only on those places where transnational operators would deploy. They would need people, even because of the biological attrition of the current operators. The schools are coming around, but I think one issue that hasn't been flagged, and I'll quickly mention it, is what the curriculum look like. Is it purely engineering, or are they actually have to incorporate it? And currently the industry is pushing into a very narrow interpretation of the curriculum because of the acute human resources demands that they have, not particularly encouraging. And so the real challenge is not that there will be, or not only enough, but that they will get the proper training. Please.
Dan Horner from Arms Control today. I wanted to ask about the back-end fuel assurance. I think most people would agree that's an important part, and many people would say even more important than the front-end fuel assurances that have been talked about. But what countries are we talking about that would actually be accepting it? Russia was at one point seen as the likely recipient, but that seems much more uncertain. I think in the U.S. it's fair to say there'd be a lot of political difficulties in taking foreign power reactors, spent fuel. Mr. McCombie talked about regional repositories, but it seems there's at least arguably a difference between one EU country taking spent fuel from a neighboring country in probably relatively small quantities as opposed to the much larger quantities from a non-EU country we'd be talking about if the Renaissance came to fruition in the way some people are envisioning. So what countries really are serious potential candidates for this mission? Thanks.
Charles, why don't you try and take
I get asked this question all the time, who's offering to do it? And my answer is nobody's offering to do it now, and we're not expecting anybody to be offering to do it right now. No siting program, no national siting program starts on day one by saying the repository is going to be here. If it does, it's headed for disaster. The closest that maybe some country came was Germany, which nominated Gorleben back in the 70s, and it's not been an unqualified success. So there are certain things you have to do before you can start talking about where the site's going to be, whether it's national or multinational. The first thing you have to do is you have to get all the actors, which in our case would be countries, together to agree that we need a common site or more than one site. If you don't pass that hurdle, then you shouldn't start looking. And then you have to build up trust in the organisation doing it and so on. And this could happen. In fact, right now there's an European Repository Development Organisation working group being set up in Europe, which will include representatives from 10 to 12 countries. This is actually being financed partly by foundations, thanks to the Sloan Foundation and I hope the Hewlett Foundation. And these countries will get together and they will not decide on day one. They will not put their hand up on day one and say, I'll have it or I won't have it. They'll go through the same process that you go through in a modern, consensual, national siting process. And if you go through that process, so you first of all establish the trust that's needed there in the implementing organisation, and that's what's lacking very often in national programmes, since the implementers are often governments who are famously not trusted. So you have to establish the trust, and then you have to build up the arguments on both sides. There are upsides and downsides to hosting repositories, and that's worked at a national scale in Finland and Sweden, where you have communities competing to host the repository. So we think that the same steps can be applied. Of course, the barriers are higher, the hurdles are greater, but it will go in the same way. And if you do that, then it's perfectly feasible, to my mind, that in Europe or any of the other areas of the world that I mentioned, that some time from now, some country will say, yeah, okay, I'm convinced we can do it. It's a good deal for us all round. So that's the approach.
Given we're beginning to run out of time, let's take all the remaining questions quickly and then have the panel answer. So just say who you're addressing it to and try to keep it brief. Go ahead.
Christina Hansel, Monterey Institute, and I'm not sure, maybe to Ernie Monitz. I just came back from the IAEA Nuclear Security Conference last week and learned that, for example, DOE labs are looking at a new way to design fuel assemblies so they're harder to cut into, and various measures to improve security. And therefore, I'm very curious about these advanced recycling concepts, because it seems to me that if you have your X plus, COEX, other such measures, the product of that will be fairly simple to then use the well-known PureX technology and derive plutonium. So I'm wondering, are there more advanced or other ideas for the future that we should be looking at that may be truly proliferation resistant, or how valuable are these processes? And what's the point of a new fuel assembly if we're just going to have COEX and so on happening?
Jessica?
Jessica Matthews, the Carnegie Endowment. I wanted to ask Ernie two questions about a possible transition to long-term managed storage in the United States. I ask it because I think that the lack of a back-end solution, a waste management solution, keeps Americans thinking about nuclear, whether or not we run short of interim storage space, keeps the country thinking about nuclear as uncertain, unproven, risky, unfinished, etc. We have a record of failure on geologic that stretches back now half a century, right, to the salt caverns in Kansas. So my first question is, what would it take, or how could you imagine politically divorcing ourselves from geologic storage and making this the mental transition to long-term managed storage? How can you imagine that happening, or can you? And the second question is whether anybody has looked at whether there's any way to use Yucca Mountain in a long-term managed storage capacity and get back some of that $9 billion. Thanks.
Please.
Tom Cochran with NRDC. I would like to get the panel's assessment of Thorium Power Inc.'s proposal to develop a seed blanket once through thorium fuel, and whether, particularly in France, whether they would have any interest in that use of that in French PWRs.
Let's get the last two questions because we were beginning to run out of time. Go ahead.
My question is to Dr. Moniz or any of the panelists.
Would you just identify yourself?
Sorry, Peter Hayes, Nautilus Institute. Much of the putative growth would come from East Asia and Southeast Asia. Yet in Indonesia, the ulama have declared a fatwa against the nuclear power plant at Muria, which is a bit of a problem for proceeding with nuclear power plants. Very rational evaluation of nuclear power reactor technology at that site in that country with their culture and the economics, not a general opposition, but specific to that site. You go through each of the Southeast Asian countries and you come up with a country-specific set of barriers that seem pretty basic and fundamental. In Vietnam, in Thailand, for different reasons, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. Taiwan is highly constrained. Korea is highly constrained. It really boils down to China, coal, and climate. So my question for Ernie is, can he actually envision China implementing the higher levels of nuclear power targets that have been announced recently, given the political and economic transition and institutional demands that would be imposed on that country over the next 20 to 30 years? Is that really believable that we could see those high levels of nuclear power growth?
Thanks. Please.
Hi.
Last question.
Jim Conkin, New Mexico State University. It was nice to see Charles refer to the only successful nuclear waste repository program in the world in southeastern New Mexico in the Solano Salt. No one ever talks about that. But we've even recently disposed of recycled spent fuel waste from defense reactors. So it's a really excellent program, but there was a bureaucratic decision made 30 years ago that kind of leaves it off of everyone's discussion. But that was merely a bureaucratic decision. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's go in reverse order in which we start.